Okay, and so on. Yeah, let me grab my pointer. There it is. Everything is so freaking clunky. Okay, so what does self-domestication mean? What does domestication mean for that matter? Because we all know it when we see it, but we don't necessarily know all of the details of how it comes about and what it actually means to domesticate an animal or a plant or a human being. So how does that work? And if we can say that humans are self-domesticated, or potentially we are there any other animals that have self-domesticated in the world? If we can find examples of those, that's a pretty strong case that humans could domesticate themselves as well. And then, if there are signs and signals for an animal being domesticated, what are those signs, and do we see them in people? Because again, that would be evidence that we are indeed domesticated. And if we are domesticated and we are self domesticated, which, that's the only way it could happen, right? Unless aliens. Um, how did we come to be domesticated? So, what's domestication mean in the first place? Hi, Coco. Well, it comes from the Latin word domesticus, which means of the home. So that's a clue to what domestication is all about, really. And if you look it up in the dictionary, it'll say something like the process whereby a population of living organisms is changed at the genetic level through generations of selective breeding to accentuate traits that are ultimately benefit to the interest of humans. Well, that's a pretty egocentric view of the world, isn't it? It's all about people. So domestication is all about changing something at the genetic level. So once you've domesticated a species, it should breed true, and all the future generations should be domesticated as well, which is an interesting thing. That means domestication must be something genetic. And it's through generations of selective breeding. So it doesn't happen suddenly, it takes a while. So if you think you're going to adopt a baby chimpanzee and you're going to tame it, it's not going to work, right? Because that chimpanzee wasn't selectively bred for tameness, and you're not going to do it overnight. Nicely disappeared, didn't he? Crap. How about JVB? JVB here? No. So it looks like we still have a problem here. Coltrane's still here. Okay. Well, and the final thing is it's for the interest of humans. And of course, since we've been the ones doing the selective breeding, obviously it's for our own benefit. So who noticed this first? Well, as usual, Darwin, right? He actually wrote a two-volume set of books called The Variation in Animals and Plants Under Domestication. And he did a whole investigation of all the different domesticated breeds, and he looked for things that were common about them. Where were the commonalities? What was the same about all the domesticated animals? And he noticed that there was a whole set of things. Uh, to start off with, domestication of animals is more than just taming. There's a whole bunch of other things that comes along with it. Not only when you nicely you're back. Did you get booted
Yeah,
nicely?
it's crashing me. Still the same
It's still
issue.
crazy. It must be the slide thing then. So it's got nothing to do with the venue. It's the software I'm using to present the slides. I'll switch to the other thing for this afternoon if you want to come back. Okay, so the domestication of animals is more than just taming. There are other effects. When you domesticate an animal, it becomes more trainable as well, among other things. And as you saw from the definition, it was for human purposes, but that wouldn't necessarily always be the case. If we find an example of an animal in the wild that's self-domesticated, that wouldn't be for human purposes. It would be for its own benefit. So we're going to take a closer look at that as we go along. The variability of physical and mental characteristics is greater in domesticated species than in their wild ancestors, including the occurrence of things that you wouldn't think would be beneficial, like dwarfism and gigantism. The behavioral plasticity and educability of domesticated species is greater as well. Um, Plasticity is, well, think about dogs and all the things dogs have been trained to do to benefit humans, right? There are dogs that are bred specifically for their ability to hunt in where there are lakes and ponds. So they're specifically bred for the hunting of ducks. And then you've got dogs that are specifically bred for the herding of sheep. Totally different skill set. An amazing thing that Darwin noticed, though, was that the brain size of domesticated animals is smaller than that of their wild ancestors. And this is kind of an unexpected result. You would think domesticated animals, because of their increased plasticity, should really be smarter or have bigger brains. Another thing he noticed that is very common amongst domesticated animals is there's a large occurrence, a very frequent occurrence of them being black and white. And in the wild, you don't see a lot of black and white animals. There's zebras, there's skunks, but for the zebra, it's camouflage, and for the skunk, it's a signal, it's a warning signal to be that specific pattern and those specific colors. In domesticated animals, though, a lot of them are black and white. It's a very common thing. A lot of domesticated animals have droopy ears. And in the wild, there's only one species that has droopy ears. Anybody know? Can't think of it? It's the elephant. Another thing about domesticated animals, they have shorter snouts and smaller teeth than their wild counterparts. They have smaller brains. And this is the brain of a wolf. This is the brain of a dog. They're about the size of a walnut. Dog brains are not very big. Most of their heads are full of bone. But anyway, you'll notice that the wolf brain is wider at this point than the dog brain. And also, if you see this fissure pattern here, makes a cross. In the wolf, here it is. And that means the wolf has this whole portion of brain in addition to what the dog has. So you got to wonder what goes on in that part of the wolf's brain that the dog can do without. And we'll try to identify that in a second. Oh, there's some stats there too. Let me go back. The pig, you'll see, has a 35% smaller brain than a wild boar. Same animal. This one bred for domesticity. Horses, a domesticated horse, 16% smaller brain than a wild horse. It's not consistent, though, because you don't see it in mice, you don't see it in rats, you don't see it in domesticated foxes. But the big thing of domestication is tameness, right? If you're going to raise an animal that weighs, over 1,000 pounds and it's got these horns on its head, you want it to not kill you every time you turn your back on it, because that would be bad, right? But look at this thing here are these two young women. They're walking through the mountains, probably in Switzerland or someplace like that, and they come across this huge beast with these horns, and they're not afraid of it. They go right up to it, they pet it. It's got indicators that it's domesticated. It's got a lot of white spots on it. It's not black and white, but it doesn't look like a wild one. It looks like a tamed one. So they feel perfectly comfortable going up to it. And we do that all the time with, huge beasts and small, and we let them into our houses and so on, where, if it was a wild thing, you'd be afraid of it. One time a possum got into my house. And of course, my wife and her mother were there at the time, and they just freaked out, because a possum is a scary animal. I had to get it out of the house. Where had it been just a tame dog from the neighborhood, it could have been a bigger animal, and they wouldn't have been afraid at all. So there's a whole collection of stuff that comes along with domestication. And it repeats. So this pigmentation thing, the white patches, the brown regions, that's typical of a whole slew of different animals. Floppy ears is common to a whole slew of domesticated animals. Smaller ears, shorter muzzles, smaller teeth, docility, smaller brains. I mean, it's in everything that's been domesticated almost. Reproductive cycles are more frequent in domesticated animals, and it's true of all these. My dog goes into heat every 6 months or so, where a wolf only goes into heat once a year. So, big difference. Um, Neotenous behavior. What that means is juvenile behavior. Neotenous meaning juvenile, right? But you see that in mice, dogs, domesticated foxes, and bonobos. And I was just thinking that this morning with my dog, because, if she knows I'm getting a special treat for her, she hears the plastic of the bag noise when I reach for it, and she gets all excited and she jumps around. She's like a little kid, and I was thinking, yeah, that's one of the things people love about dogs is they act like little kids. They get all excited, and that's neotenous behavior, and it's something you find attractive. And finally, curly tails, and you see that in a lot of animals too that are domesticated, but seldom in the wild do you see an animal with a curly tail. The brain size thing, this is a graph that shows where the brain size in the domesticated animal should be the same as in the wild animal. And here's where different animals fall. They actually have smaller brains. The lab rat versus the wild rat has a much smaller brain than the lab rat. Domesticated ferrets, much smaller brains than wild. Llamas, here the pig is somewhere in the middle of where it ought to be. So another common trait of domesticated animals is that smaller brain. And it goes on and on into lots of details. This is the functioning of the brain itself. Uh, Olfactory structures. Remember I showed you how much smaller the dog brain was from the wolf? Well, they only show a poodle here, but you see the poodle's brain is 33% smaller than a wolf's for olfactory structures. That means a wolf has a much better sense of smell than a domesticated dog, much better. Here's another one. The cerebellum is the part of your brain that controls repetitive motor functions like running, dancing, playing the piano, stuff like that. Oh, I'm sorry, that's the wrong thing, isn't it? Is that, that's right. And you see in all these different animals, that part of the brain is much smaller, except in the pig, where it's bigger, which is strange. Pigs have a strangeness about them. But again, if you look at something like a poodle, that part of the brain is much smaller. The limbic structures, they're responsible for things like emotion and goal orientation and stuff like that. And again, that part of the brain is much smaller in domesticated animals. So all of these things have an impact on behavior, right? And maybe it comes along with the tameness, might even be responsible for the tameness. So anyway, you tame an animal and you get these other things. You get the floppy ears, you get the short legs, you get the short tail, you get the curly tail, you get the black and white coloring, and on and on. And these are all common. So what do we see? If you tame an animal, you get the things you tamed it for, the reduction in aggression, the reduction in fear, the reduction in stress response, but then you get the other stuff too. Smaller brain, smaller muzzle, smaller teeth, white patches, floppy ears. And you got to ask the question, why? Why does that happen? And people used to make up stuff. They'd say, well, the color makes it easier to find an animal when it gets lost, right? And before people understood genetics, they would have to make stuff up and hope it stuck, and they would try to rationalize the world that way. So why does it have a smaller brain? Well, so it can't escape easily. right? And that came along with taming it and so on. But it's obviously nonsense. Uh, but there is a plausibly genetic mediated effect in domestication where maybe when you selectively breed for one thing, you accidentally do something else as part of the breeding process for tameness, right? Maybe when you breed something out of it, you accidentally get this other thing that you for. It's just sounds like I'm losing my mind. Let me try this. Better to have a. Can you hear? Yes. No. No. That means I'm gonna have to leave and come back. Uh, so, with me, folks.
Just a couple of seconds. Yes. No, you have to be. You have to raise your voice.
How about now? Okay.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can get my controls back. Oh, how about that? That almost never works. Okay, so I can pick right up where I left off. Let me move ahead here. So, how does domestication work? How does it work? Well, I'm going to tell you a story now. It's kind of a long story, but it's an interesting one. There was this guy in Russia. His name was Dmitry Belayev, and he was a zoologist. And his boss was what we call a Lamarckian and what the Russians called a Lysenkoist. Okay. And what that means is a Lamarckian is somebody who believes in an idea that was brought forward by a guy named Lamarck. And his idea was this. This was around the time of Darwin. Lamarck believed that if you had an animal that ate leaves off of trees, then that animal would want to have a longer neck so he could reach higher up into the tree. And because he kept stretching his neck to reach higher and higher into the tree, the offspring of that animal would be born with a longer neck. Okay, so it was kind of I really want to be able to fly, and if I keep wishing I could fly, eventually my offspring will be born with wings, right? And that's how people actually thought it worked. And there are a lot of people that believe that's the way it works even today, although we know it's not right. But anyway, Belayev was not a Lamarckian. He was a Darwinist. But that created a lot of arguments between him and his boss. And what happened in Russia in the early 50s, if you disagreed with your boss, was he would send you to Siberia. And that's what happened to Belayev. He got sent to Siberia because he had a different theory of evolution than his boss did. Okay? So he winds up in Siberia. He became, though, the director of the Institute of Cytology and Genetics after he had gone to Siberia and became very successful in his line of research. And his line of research while he was in Siberia, he said, well, while I'm here, I'm going to test my theories without my boss's interference. And the theory I want to test is, how do animals get domesticated? How does that work? I mean, that's what he set out to prove. So he wanted to breed a whole new animal into domestication. And the animal he picked was the silver fox. And I know I lost my pointer. And here are foxes here, and they share a common ancestor with all these other animals: dogs, wolves, coyotes, jackals. Now, he knew that domestic dogs shared a common ancestry with foxes. So, if you can domesticate a dog, there's a high probability you could domesticate a fox. Although at the time, there were no domesticated foxes. They were bred in captivity for their fur. So the people that raised them didn't care if they were tame or not. They lived in a cage, and eventually they were going to get disassembled and turned into coats. And this was a very profitable business if you lived in Siberia raising red foxes. So there were a lot of fox, or silver foxes rather. There were a lot of fox farmers in Siberia, which was great for Belayev because he could just go to these farmers and say, I want to buy 100 foxes or 50 or however many you can sell me, right? And that's what he would do. And then he started to go into the, well, okay, now I've got all these foxes. How do I tame these things and turn them into nice animals that are friendly? Okay, that's immaterial. But he started to do his taming process, and I'll talk about how that worked in a minute. I want to show you the rates of success because this is really amazing. After just 6 generations, okay? So he started in what, 59? After 6 generations, he tested 213 pups that he had raised, and 4 of them were tame in that you could handle them. They wouldn't try to bite you. They showed all of the signs of being tame, like floppy ears and curly tails and so on. So that was 1.8% of his population of 213 turned out to be tame. After 10 generations, he was up to 17.8% of them being tame, 66 pups. And of course, he kept crossbreeding these tame ones with the more docile ones, and he kept getting better and better numbers until after 42 generations, he had 71% tame. Well, 42 generations, if they're gestating once a year, right? That's 42 years. But if you think in terms of evolution, 42 years to create a whole tame species of fox, that's a pretty amazing rapidity in getting to the goal you wanted. 42 generations, not a lot. So he was very successful. And I think I must have lost the slide. Let me see if I did. No, I didn't. Darn. If I lost it the hard way. Okay. Anyway, one of the things he looked for was genetic changes in the foxes themselves. And he did find an area where the fox's genes had actually changed considerably. And he looked into that and compared it with the genes of dogs and wolves. What was the difference in the genetic structure of dogs versus wolves, and what was the difference in genetic structure between wild silver foxes and tame silver foxes? And he located it, and it was this little tiny area here in red. So he got right down to where in genetic structure the fox changed once it had been domesticated. But at the time, they didn't know what that was responsible for. Okay, they found the change in the genetics, but they didn't know what it was for. But it did prove something. It proved it was genetic. When you tame something, you change its genetic structure in some way. And the other thing he proved was when he tamed the foxes, they acted and changed the same way other domesticated animals had. So he proved a couple of really important things already. One is that it changes the genetics of the animals, and when you domesticate an animal, they all change the same way, which is also interesting. And he developed this model for how you tame something and what it does to the social behavior of that thing you tamed. And this is what he came up with. One of the things he saw was that in the domesticated fox, and that's what they looked like after they were domesticated, and it became a really cute animal, right? This is the wild version, Look at this thing. It's a monster. They weren't that big, but if you were going to reach your hand towards this thing, you knew it was going to bite you, or claw you, or try to kill you if it could. It's got these massive teeth. It's displaying its ears, which are very pointed in a hostile manner. It's arching its back. Its hackles are up. It's tucked its tail under. It's showing its claws. It's a wild animal, right? And here it is 42 generations later, and it's piebald. And you can't see the floppy ears in this picture. That one's a little floppy, but it's got this big bushy tail. And, I'll show you in other pictures, it's curly. There's one thing that didn't change, though, is they still smell like foxes. So they don't make great pets because they stink. But other than that, he saw that there were elevated serotonin levels in the tame fox. There's a chemical, tryptophan hydroxylase, which you can buy at the drugstore, by the way. It's called 5-HTP. And it's the key enzyme in serotonin synthesis. And it's much higher in the tame foxes than in the wild foxes. And the basal stress-induced cortisol levels are 3 to 5 times lower in the domesticated foxes. And cortisol is the stress chemical that your body produces for flight or fight syndrome kind of activities and reactions. Really good. So selection for tameness alone. That's all he selected for. And I think I lost the slide where let me look ahead a little bit. Yeah, I lost the slide that showed how they tame the animals. But the way he would tame the animals is he would have his assistants. They had a lot of foxes, right? They started with 200. So he had 4 or 5 assistants that would go up to the cage with a clipboard every day, and they would start out standing some distance away from the fox in the cage, and they would note the behavior of the fox. Did it go into the aggressive stance? Did it snarl? Did it show its teeth? And so on. And they would check all the boxes. Then they would go 5 feet closer and again, record the responses of the fox. And then they would go all the way up to the fox, the cage itself, and make another record. They would do this for all the foxes, and then they would take the ones that showed the least aggression, although they're still aggressive, right? They're still wild animals, but some were a little less aggressive than others. You could get a little closer before they got nasty. But they would take those and they would crossbreed them. And then the pups that were born, while they were still babies, they would pick them up and they would pet them and stroke them and put them back in the cage. And they would do this until they got too nasty to handle. And then they would continue with the rest of the process, and they would track all these pups and then interbreed them again. And of course, they'd have to keep bringing in new foxes over time as well, because their bred population was getting smaller and smaller, right? After 42 generations, they had over 72% being tame following this process. And just doing that led to all the other traits in the domestication syndrome: the floppy ears, the piebald, smaller teeth, smaller heads, all of that stuff. And they knew it was genetic. They didn't know why. What were those genes all about? What was going on exactly? And it turned out that there was a common denominator, and it's a structure called the neural crest. And this is a structure that all mammals have. The neural crest, though, shows up when you're a blastocyst, right? So when your mama's egg got fertilized, after 2 to 3 weeks, you would be a blastocyst, and there's a structure that you would have called the neural crest. And it's on the surface of the blastocyst, and I'll show you another picture in a minute. But there's this area where there was a strip that had epidermal tissue, and then a border of a different tissue, and then this area called the neural plates, and that would fold together, right? So when it folded together, it formed this thing called a neural tube. And the neural tube is what's going to later become your brain and your backbone and your nervous system. But when it comes together, this green part here, that's the neural crest, starts sending out neural crest cells that are messengers to the rest of the blastocyst that say, we're in this stage of development. It's time to start creating new structures. So you pluripotent stem cells are going to turn into teeth, and you pluripotent stem cells are going to turn into bones, and so on, right? And that's what the purpose of the neural crest cells is. So here's a picture of an actual blastocyst of it could be a human or it could be a dog, but it's 2 to 3 weeks old, and these are dyed neural crest cells so you can see them. So this is how they're traveling out, and this is the neural crest here, okay? And they go out as messengers, and they send out messages to other cells in your body telling them what to do, how to grow, what to become, and this is what they do. They're precursors for melanocytes, which control pigmentation. So why do domesticated animals have less coloration and tend to be more black and white? Because these melanocytes are repressed. Odontoblasts form teeth. So why do domesticated animals have smaller teeth? Because the neural crest cells are repressed. Bones and muscles of the face and snout, cartilage of the ear, there's your floppy ears, and sympathetic nervous system. And that's why maybe tameness comes around. So selection for tameness in domesticated animals leads to reduced fear, which is the thing you're driving, right? That's what you're looking for. But you get this because you're selecting for animals that have a repressed neural crest. And it's even a disease if it goes too far. There are two diseases, you can look them up, I don't remember what they are, but there are two diseases humans get if, when they're in their embryological stage, they don't get enough neural crest stimulation sent out, they end up with deformities and brain malfunctions and things like that. But when you're breeding for it, you're actually breeding for a repressed neural crest. You get all this other repression too, which gives you the domestication syndrome. Okay, so that's how domestication works. It's selectively breeding for a repressed neural crest.
Jolly.
And when you do it, you get the things you bred for. You get the things you didn't breed for but come along with it, because they both are caused by the same thing, the reduced neural crest input. And then you get the smaller brain, but they're not really sure why the smaller brain happens. They haven't actually figured that part out yet, which is something we're going to wait for. So they haven't accounted for that. They know specific genes are involved in reducing or delaying neural crest development in domesticated species.
Hello.
Please don't talk while I'm talking, okay? Yeah, hello.
I have some doubts, sir.
Okay, please stop talking, okay? Thank you. So we expect that there's a bunch of genes involved in doing this. We don't even know which ones they are specifically, but we expect there to be several. So I started this thing by saying that humans are self-domesticated. And if humans are self-domesticated, then maybe there are other self-domesticated animals. So let's see if we can find any. Well, bonobos, and you guys all know about bonobos from my talk about sex, right? Bonobos are self-domesticated. And we assume that's the case because if you look at chimpanzees, and they came from a common ancestor, chimpanzees and bonobos, the bonobos are much less aggressive than chimpanzees are. So at some point, chimpanzees and bonobos both separated from a common ancestor. The chimpanzees remained extremely wild and hostile, but bonobos became less and less aggressive. And we see this in some other animals, and they have common traits. if they live in very small groups, they tend to be more domesticated than if they're in very large groups. And you would have to assume that too much competition in a very small group would lead to extinction of the group. So that kind of makes sense. Animals that live on islands tend to be more domesticated for the same kinds of reasons, right? They're all competing for a limited set of resources. So being too aggressive would lead to the demise of the species. So they have to back off, and somehow they self-domesticate themselves to do that. Animals that live in very low energy habitats tend to self-domesticate because, again, they're competing for very scarce resources. And then, of course, we've domesticated some things. But when we're looking for self-domesticated animals, we want to look for the same things we would look for in domesticated animals that we've domesticated. The same traits, the same unselected traits. And it doesn't matter how they domesticated themselves. We don't care about that so much as just finding species that has self-domesticated and then figure out the why on the back end. So here we compare chimpanzees and bonobos. Within group, chimpanzees will kill each other. They will kill each other. A female chimpanzee will kill another female chimpanzee and steal her children if she can't have children of her own. That's a pretty violent kind of behavior. I'm getting noise from you, Venkram. Could you mute yourself, please? In bonobos, there's just as much aggressive behavior, but almost never does a bonobo kill another bonobo in its own tribe. Never happens. Chimpanzees will charge at each other. They'll bluff that they're going to kill each other. They'll show their teeth. They'll even grab at each other. And again, bonobos don't do that. When bonobos have an argument, what do? They have sex. Chimpanzees behave the same way, whether they're captive or wild. They're just as aggressive when they're captive. And you've read stories about this where a woman adopts a chimpanzee and later on it rips her face off, right? Because it's a wild animal. It's never been tamed. Bonobo wouldn't do that to you. Bonobos, they'd want to have sex with you if you'd let them. And in chimpanzees, this aggression is both in the females and the males. So big difference. So bonobos are apparently self-domesticated. And you get all of the features that you would expect. The chimpanzee has much larger teeth. You can see, I mean, these things are like vampire teeth, right? But a bonobo has teeth kind of like humans do. So that's a sign of domestication. Their faces are less dimorphic in bonobos. In fact, the males and the females look very much alike, where in chimpanzees, females look very different than the males in terms of their faces. So there is a craniofacial feminization in bonobos, which is typical of domestication. When you look this up, you get different numbers. I've seen anything from 6 million years to 9 million years where they diverged, bonobos and chimpanzees, from a common ancestor. So they had a common ancestor here, and chimpanzees went their way and bonobos went their way. And you can see the chimpanzee, this is a male, he's a big brutish guy. Chimpanzees are extremely strong. They're anywhere from 6 to 10 times as strong as a human, and yet they're much smaller than a human. But, you know, really nasty animals, huge teeth, pretty ferocious. And here's a bonobo, and you can see that they're very gracile looking. This is a male, again, feminized in his stature. So pretty small. So big difference. Large cranium in relation to the body, very much like his ancestors, where the bonobo has a small juvenile-like cranium, short face, small teeth. So signs of domestication. And we've got the whole ball of wax here. We've got the traits we select for when we're taming something, and we've got some of the unselected traits. reduction in brain size, reduced muscles and teeth. And here you can see the skeleton. Here's the teeth of a chimpanzee compared to the teeth of a bonobo. The shape of the head, very different. Slender bones compared to the chimpanzee. And skull indentation are disproportionately small relative to other independent. Chimpanzees, when it's 4 or 5 years old, a bonobo 7 or 8 years old. Much later, they retain tolerance longer. They play more as adults. Chimpanzees, when they're adults, they show aggressive behavior toward each other, or they show grooming behaviors. But bonobos actually play with each other. Bonobos show more signs of adult homosexuality. They have more pedomorphic anatomy, meaning they are more like children in their cranial structure. I'll show you a picture of that if I didn't lose it. They're born with white tails, the chimps and the bonobos, but the bonobos keep their white tail patch, and the chimpanzees lose it. Pedomorphic cognition, which means it takes them longer to learn, but they learn more, and they become inhibited much later in life than a chimpanzee would. They show other things: pink lips, white toes, white tip of the tail. So we see it. We see the selected traits and we see the unselected traits. Therefore, ergo, bonobos must be domesticated. And I thought I had a slide on how they domesticated, but the only thing that's shown in this slide about how they got domesticated is that the females form coalitions. And bonobos, after they were separated from chimpanzees, bonobos were separated by the Congo River. So chimpanzees live on one side of the Congo River, bonobos live on the other side. So they were totally separated for over 1 million years. So that's 1 million generations, let's say, right? When that 1 million generations, what happened to the bonobos is the females formed coalitions, and the females are given credit for having tamed the whole bonobo species. And we'll talk about that in a bit too. Here's another example. This is the Procolobus. I'm getting an echo off of you, Roscoe. I'm going to mute you. This is a Procolobus monkey. There are two versions of this monkey. One that grows up on mainland Africa, that's this guy, and one that grows up on the island of Zanzibar, which is off the coast of Africa. And you notice that the Procolobus that grew up on the island shows white and black pigmentation, as opposed to the pigmentation that you see in the wild animal, which is an indicator, right? Probably tamed. And you notice also that the adult island Procolobus looks like the infant mainland Procolobus more than he looks like the adult mainland Procolobus. So it's more pedomorphic in the way it looks. More of a pedomorphic skull, feminized. So again, indicators of domestication. It was isolated for 600,000 years, got the pedomorphic coloring, reduced sexual dimorphism in body mass. Males are smaller, they have pedomorphic cranial traits. And one of the interesting things is the adult males and the adult female Procolobus will nurse a pregnant or, a Procolobus that's given birth right into their adulthood. So how do we know we are domesticated? Are we showing any signs of domestication? Darwin said in 1872, man in many respects may be compared with those animals which have long been domesticated. Eugene Fisher said the racial characteristics of man due to domestication, and he said this in 1914, in which the nutrition and reproduction has been influenced over a number of generations by humans. So he points to domestication and even says humans did it to themselves. Konrad Lorenz refers to domestication-induced disorders of species typical behavior. And we do and we do not fit the model, which is interesting. And you saw this too when I talked about the role of sex in human evolution. We do and we do not fit the models that are typical of all the other species. And it's also true of us in terms of domestication. This is what we looked at like about 3 million years ago. That's Australopithecus. He was a bipedal ape, had very large, thick, enameled teeth, but small canines, relatively small. So there were signs of domestication even back at 3 million years ago. But he had a small brain, only 350% of that is a third of a liter, a third of a quart. Pretty small. If you're a buck, 350 again, that's a golden earthquake. I actually more. It's always been that common knowledge. Turns out later on they thought that primarily. Like I'm losing my mic again. Did fix that? Fix it? Is it yeah.
It's still choppy.
Back. Still
Can't
choppy.
hear you now.
Leave it at nope. Slower to get here.
Does it dissipate to everyone else? Or is it just me?
I think he's gonna rejoin.
Yeah, he's disappeared.
Yeah, his voice keeps stuttering. Oh, is everyone else getting that?
Yep.
Yeah. He's gone invisible.
Okay. I thought it was me.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Great.
We good?
Yes.
Yay.
Yep.
You were stuttering and then you went off.
Okay. So let's talk about neoteny. Neoteny is looking like a child when you're an adult. Okay, and you can see this is an adult chimpanzee and an infant chimpanzee. I got to get my pointer back again. And you can see that an infant chimpanzee has a very round skull. Its face does not protrude, right? Where the adult, the whole shape of the face changes, and you get this jutting structure out here, and the big teeth and all of that, right? So big difference in the way the face of a chimpanzee changes as it grows into an adult. And if you look at it over time, you start out with this shape of a face, and then it gets squatter and longer, and you get these huge teeth out here and the extended jaw. This is how humans, though, age in terms of how their skull is shaped. And you notice that the adult human skull is very much like the infant chimpanzee skull and the infant human skull. It doesn't change in shape as drastically as we see the chimpanzee change. So you can make the assumption then that the human face is a little more pedomorphic, a lot more pedomorphic than a chimpanzee face gets when it grows into an adult. And that's also a sign of domestication. Now, in terms of human evolution, this is 6 to 9 million years back. Hominids and chimpanzees had a common ancestor. So, we are not descended from chimps, but we are both descended from something. About 3.5 million years ago, one of our genes, the SRGAP2 gene, got duplicated, and our brains went from 350 cubic centimeters to about 400 to 500 cubic centimeters at that time. Then 2.5 million years ago, a million years later, that same gene got duplicated again, and our brains went to 600 cubic centimeters, which is really significant. That's a pretty big jump from 4 to 5 to 600. And usually when you see two numbers like this, it's usually the female and the male brains. But don't let that make you think anything about human intelligence. It turns out that females are just as smart as men, even when their brains are smaller, and that's true through all our history, as far as we can tell. But anyway, when our brains got this big, 600 cubic centimeters, that's when we started using stone tools, and we started eating meat, and started using fire. Right, so this was a huge step in our evolution, 600 cubic centimeters. Then 2 million years ago, a half a million years later, a gene mutated called the ARH-gap11B gene, and that again increased the size of the brain. But also what happened is the surfaces of our brain got convolutions. So that meant the surface of the human brain got a lot bigger because it was all convoluted. So all those peaks and valleys gave it more surface area. And that's the part of the brain where consciousness resides. So at this point, we probably started becoming very conscious in terms of being aware of our environment and putting meaning into our environment. 1.8 million years ago, our brain's a little bigger now, 1,000 cubic centimeters, and we start crafting stone tools, spearheads, things like that. Oh, this is where the use of fire comes in. Sorry, got that wrong. 1.2 million years ago, the human population was only about 55,000 individuals. So everything that we had evolved to at this point could spread through the entire population because the population was so small. 195,000 years ago, that's when we became Homo sapiens with a brain of 1,350 cubic centimeters. So big change from here to here in terms of brain size. We went from 350 cubic centimeters in Australopithecus all the way to 1,350 cubic centimeters in Homo sapiens. 150,000 years ago, something really amazing happened. Part of the brain called the precuneus enlarged. And the precuneus is considered the seat of everything in your brain that relates to self. Okay, so now you could start thinking about the world in terms of I'm an agent, you're an agent. If I think things, you must think things, right? If I get hurt, well, that means you can get hurt. And when you get hurt, I know how that feels, right? And then you could even have things like empathy. 70,000 years ago, that's when that big volcano erupted, Tuva. Human population again scrunched down to between 10 and 30,000 people. And again, population sweep. Everything that we had evolved to at that point could sweep through the entire human population. 50,000 years ago, the FOXP2 gene mutates and we can speak. And then 20,000 years ago, the human brain begins to shrink. And what is that an indicator of? Domestication. When the human brain starts getting smaller, it's a sign of domestication. But there is no whole brain neoteny. Neoteny exchanges are restricted to specific processes in specific brain regions, which means part of your brain can change with regard to tameness or self-domestication, where other parts of your brain don't have to and don't. Some human development processes, such as expression of genes controlling synaptic development, are neotenic in humans. And what does that mean? When you're born, when you're a baby, when you're less than 2 years old, actually when you're less than 1 year old, almost every neuron in your brain has as many dendrites as it can possibly produce, and everything is cross-connected. So when you talk to a baby, I'm getting noise from somebody. Please don't talk. Right, in very small babies, before their brains have organized, there's just dendrites everywhere. Everything is cross-connected in the brain. So it's all a lot of noise. And there's also a lot of can't think of the word for it, but it's crosstalk between different senses. So you might smell a smell, but it makes a noise in your head as though you heard a bell ringing, right? Or you might see a color, and that might make you taste something, right? And that's called synesthesia, very common in little babies. And what happens is as the babies learn things about the world, there is actually pruning of all of those dendrites. And the brain actually gets less complex as the baby learns because it becomes more organized. Okay. And that period of time, that whole neotenic development in humans is 15 years long. Your brain doesn't actually fix until you're in your 20s. So I know we give people the rights of adults, um, for different things that they're allowed to do at different ages, but your brain doesn't actually become an adult brain until you're in your 20s. And this is because of the fact that we're domesticated in part. Disruption of neotenic development leads to loss of social cognition. So you get, you end up on the spectrum, and other things can happen too. Here's an example of Heidelbergensis. This is 700,000, 300,000 years ago. This line shows the brow ridge jutting out from the skull, going straight down, and you can see how much of the face is in front of the brow ridge, where in the modern human, here's the brow ridge, and almost none of the face is jutting out in front of it. So you can see the facial size reduction and the facial retraction. These are indicators of self-domestication, right? I talked before about olfactory reduction in the brain of a dog as opposed to a wolf. Remember, it was this thing in the wolf that was sticking way out. There's also limbic reduction. Limbic reduction, remember, the limbic system is responsible for emotions, goals, things like that. And we see the same thing in human brains, reduction of olfactory and limbic structures. Here's olfactory receptors in different animals. So here it is in apes. And if we are descended from common ancestors, you would think our olfactory receptors would be around here, but they're way, way more reduced than apes. So apes can smell things that we can't smell, which is, again, a result of the fact that we're domesticated and the apes aren't. They don't have bonobos up there. That's too bad. All right, there's, the differences between the skulls of wolves and dogs, as we've seen before. And here's a human skull. And pre-modern man starts here. This is our baseline. And then early humans, hominids, you see these different markers like, I forget what half of these things stand for, but there are different measurements. Like this red line is the distance from here to here. Okay. And you can see that over time, that distance has decreased. And that's true of a lot of other measurements, like this distance here has decreased over time. And even if you take into account the change in the size of the human body, which has also decreased, then it's still significant, still a significant decrease. So again, indications that we're domesticated. So brain reduction in the last 30,000 years, shorter face, smaller teeth, reduced sexual dimorphism in skulls. You can't tell a female skull from a male skull, not very well. And pedomorphic behavior, it takes a human, about at least 15 years to become independent. And adults play, which is something, again, adult primates tend not to do that. So then the question is, how do we get this way? Good question, right? Well, let me start by saying there's two kinds of aggression. There's an aggression that you exhibit when you fly off the handle. Okay, and sometimes people get like that, right? You'll push somebody's button. You'll bump into somebody at the airport after they've been on a long flight and they're really irritated, and they'll just yell at you and get real nasty all of a sudden. That's called reactive aggression. Okay, and that's flying off the handle. It's like, well, I lost control. Reactive aggression. Then there's another kind of aggression where you say, this guy Bob at work is really bugging the hell out of me. I got to figure out a way to make him stop. What do I do? Do I go to my boss? Do I confront him directly? Do I get him fired somehow? Do I embarrass him so he'll leave me alone? Do I meet him in the parking lot and punch him in the nose, right? And it's me thinking out scenarios proactively being aggressive against Bob. That's called proactive aggression. So there's reactive aggression and proactive aggression. And this is an example from an anthropologist who worked for 17 years with the Ake foragers in South America. And in 17 years of living with these people, these two guys, Hill and Hurtado, never saw them scuffle or reactively aggress against each other. He never saw anybody get into a scuffle. Men scuffle at 1,000th of the rate of chimpanzees. Chimpanzees scuffle constantly. It's a constant thing. With humans, it's very, very rare. If you compare the aggression of humans to the aggression of chimpanzees, including World War I and World War II, we are 1,000th as aggressive as chimpanzees. So that's a huge reduction in aggression in humans. But we do exhibit aggression, right? We exhibit aggression like war and homicide and genocide and torture and capital punishment. But these all have one thing in common. They're all proactive aggression, which is common in humans. It's premeditated, it's low arousal. You can think about killing somebody without even being angry at them at the moment. Right? Grandfather. And is called premeditated murder. Reactive aggression is very low in human. This is business where you bump into somebody in a parking lot, you've had a few too many, and you pull out a gun and shoot them. It's a very rare thing in humans. So how did we get to the point of low active aggression, which we have, and high proactive aggression, which we also have? Well, if we go back about 200,000 years, that's when we became Homo sapiens, right? That's when it must have started, because that's when we start to see the signs of self-domestication. And here's a story. This comes from Africa. This is a pygmy tribe. I forget the name of the tribe, but there's a guy in this tribe. His name is Twi. Okay. And Twi is reactively aggressive, and he does terrible things. He's killed 3 people in the tribe. And when the community gets together and talks about it, they say, look, this guy Twi, he's killing people. I'm afraid for my wife and kids. I'm afraid for you. We should do something about this guy. And the other guys in the tribe say, you're right. We really ought to do something about it. So they get together and they vote, and they decide they're going to kill Twi. And they hide out on a trail they know he's going to be on. And when he comes along, they ambush him and they kill him. And here's the interesting thing. The really interesting thing is there is a threat of retribution from Twi's family. So how do you eliminate that? Well, what you do is you get Twi's relatives to agree to be part of it. And in fact, they're the ones that stab him first. And everybody in the village, every male member of the village, stabs him, even if he's already dead. So the vote is unanimous in the village to do away with this guy who is dangerous to every member of the village. This occurs worldwide in hunter-gatherers on every continent. And we know this from historical records as well as modern anthropology, but this goes way, way back to the earliest days of keeping anthropological records, that everybody did this or does it today. The most common victims are almost always male, and they're always or usually aggressive males. And it makes sense, right? Especially if you have females in coalitions in your society. Because if the females get together and say, guys, Twee is, he's raping the women, he beats his wife, his kids are afraid of him, he's killed 3 men, do something about it. And then they get the reaction from the male side to actually do something about it. It's used as a mechanism of social control. Okay, so in a society where you are close-knit, it's a small tribe, maybe as big as 150 individuals, but usually much smaller groups than that, there's a lot of pressure to eliminate reactively aggressive people. There are no laws, so this is how you do it. The rates are unknown in small-scale societies because as soon as an anthropologist comes into the group, they either stop doing it or they hide it. Because the anthropologist is not a member. He doesn't get a vote. He doesn't get to know what's going on either. So they're very secretive about it. Today, it's responsible for over 15% of male deaths in New Guinea today. Now, these are also some things you got to think about from the talk we had on the role of sex in human evolution, right? We went from many-to-many sperm competition to monogamy, and because of the way we do mutual sexual selection, we have low physical dimorphism, which resulted from self-domestication. We have females sharing power and conflicts being resolved with sex, and women forming coalitions to help guide the direction of selection. And we get things like selection based on parroting competence, homogamy, people being nice to each other. Okay, so we're actually breeding niceness too into the society. This came later, though. This came later than the selection for proactive aggression versus reactive aggression. During less fertile phases, though, we know too that women are drawn to more feminine and compassionate men. So we're breeding domesticity into the species when we're doing that kind of thing. These men are referred to as dads. They tend to be more reliable, warm, and faithful. So we're breeding that into the species. We're selecting now for things like knowledge and skill and polity and status and virtue. And, this is things we're breeding into the species. But I think these things started to come a lot later. Another thing that you have to take into account is language. And language didn't pop up in our civilization until about 50,000 years ago. And that was due to a particular gene mutation. Suddenly we started to get language, right? And we started to talk. And that's when you can actually start to talk about aggressors and what do you do about them. Before that point, the only thing you could do about an aggressor was react aggressively to the aggressor. And that's what you see in chimpanzees, reactive aggression and against aggression. Which is we talk about it, and we try to talk the aggression, talk people down.
Your speech is going again.
No.
No, it's still
No?
going.
Okay. Back now.
Chinese re-entering.
Where I got kicked out earlier. Did it kick me out? Yeah, I've got a black screen now. Right.
And let me get the pointer. Can you hear me? Good to go? Okay. So, about 50,000 years ago, we start talking to each other about aggressors and what are we going to do about them, and we kill them. And that's a selection against reactive aggression, but not a selection against proactive aggression, right? So that's how we could keep one and lose the other. But what does that do? It means what we're selecting for is a repressed neural crest, right? That's what's happening. People that don't have suppressed neural crests are reactively aggressive, and they get cut out of our society. They're no longer allowed to reproduce. But the people who are nice and have a repressed neural crest get to reproduce. And the neural crest over time is going to get more and more repressed, and we become more and more domesticated and show all the things that you see with self-domestication: reduced aggressive anatomy, reduced sexual dimorphism, pedomorphic cranial growth, reduced cranial size, pedomorphic behavior, adult play, learning, homosexuality, all of those things that come with domestication. And then we end up in a cycle, a loop, where we start with this language-based cooperation, giving us capital punishment, which reduces our reactive aggression. We get some of the signs of self-domestication. We get more tolerant and cooperative, and then we can just keep going around and around like this, and eventually we get to where we are today. And that's how it works. That's how we became self-domesticated. Are you smacking your lips? That's what it looks like, but it's cute. I like it.
I'm clapping my hands.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So, anybody have any questions or comments or want to discuss this? I'm getting an echo off you, Adam. Anybody? Thoughts, ideas, questions? Joe, you're getting an echo too. But if you have a question, go ahead.
Oh man, that sucks. Yeah, I do have a question actually. Would there be any advantage, like evolutionarily or on the evolution of it, if we undomesticated ourselves to revert back to a state where we were kind of savages in a way?
Well, that could happen, in fact, and in parts of the world, I think it may even be happening, because one of the things that was key to us becoming the homogenized group we are is the fact that at points in our evolution, we were down to very small numbers, right? 44,000 at one point, 10 to 30,000 at another point. So we all inherited the same traits, and they spread through the entire population before we spread throughout the world. But then we get to the world we're in today, where you have populations that are isolated. And we do see that there are places in the world where the people are very different. In Africa, you have tribes of pygmies who are very small, and Watusi who are very tall, right? And that's because they were isolated from each other and they evolved in different directions. So we're going back to having a lot of differences, and it's quite possible that reactive aggression, could breed back into a society that's isolated and doesn't have that enforcement. But the opposite side of that coin, though, is that we have laws now where we enforce that stuff in a very cold, systematic way. So it would have to be a place where either the laws are bizarre or they're not enforced or there are no laws or something like that. Um, if it happened, I think it would be a sad state of affairs and it would be a terrible place to live, and don't go there. Right? That's a place where you don't want to walk down a dark alley. Anybody else have a thought? Cyborg? Are you raising your hand or what? Is that a high five? I don't know what that means. Kristen,
No,
do you
that's
have a
a
question?
I do.
Oh,
But it sounds
I'm
like
sorry.
he does
Well,
too,
let
so you could let him
let
go first.
Let
Yeah.
Cyborg go. Yeah. What is it?
Yeah, so I was thinking about how, when you study domestication, how, like anyone who was trying to study domestication with the help, and like on the lines of evolution, how did they mask the environmental factors, which plays huge part, and still study the features which are common in domesticated animals, domestication.
I'm not sure I understood the question. Could you just give me the nut?
How did people like whoever was studying the domestication did mask the environmental
The
factors?
domestication of humans
Yeah.
or the domestication of animals?
Domestication of both animals and humans, because most of the time the features which you get are more about the environment you are living in and the
Right. Well, that would be what people thought in the first place, right? Is why when I domesticate a cow does it turn out to be white and brown or white and black, where the wild one never looked like that? Maybe it's the environmental factors of living on the farm, right? But what you see is in all domesticated animals, you get the same kinds of indicators that come up. Floppy ears are very common in domesticated animals. They don't exist in wild animals. How could that be an impact of the environment that they were domesticated in? How would the environment give them floppy ears, right? If you understand how evolution works, you'd be looking for something selecting for floppy ears as opposed to ears that stand up. And there is no selection going on. So that has to be a side effect of the domestication itself or a side effect of what you're feeding the animal, maybe. But different domesticated animals eat different kinds of food. So, again, the only common thing is the fact that they're domesticated at all and that they were bred for a lack of aggression.
Yeah, for example, if you take the example of floppy hairs, it may be, it is possible that when animals are in wild, their ears might be helping them in some situations, and when we are domesticating animals, they are in our house or in on our farm, which is relatively more safer, and maybe because of that, they have different kind of features. So the environmental factor, like
wait a minute.
Yeah.
The way evolution works, if floppy ears give the animal an advantage when it's in living in the house, say, where in the wild pointy ears give it an advantage in the wild. The reason it has the pointy ears is because its ancestors who had the pointy ears that stood up could hear better directionally, and because they could hear better directionally, they survived. The ancestors that had floppy ears couldn't hear well directionally, they were killed. And that's why their offspring only had good directionality in hearing. Okay, so for that to go away and get floppy ears, somehow the floppy ears would have to be selected for, or the pointy ears would have to be selected against. But when you bring an animal into your house, there are no predators that are going to come and kill the ones with the pointy ears. There are no diseases that are going to favor floppy ears versus pointer ears. The only thing that causes that is the domestication, and they localized it. They said it's the neural crest. That they localized what was happening as the animal grew up, as it formed, that gave it the floppy ears, right? So it's nailed down. This is a very solid case. Yeah, Kristen, you had something you wanted to talk about.
I had a twofold comment / question. You
Yeah.
mentioned
Hang on just a
serotonin.
second. I'm gonna give you the megaphone, okay?
Okay.
Let me. I gotta find you here. There you are. Okay, you got it.
So you mentioned serotonin and cortisol
Yeah.
levels being changed and different in the animal model once they started to domesticate themselves or be bred to domesticate.
Yep.
Found it interesting because it almost seems like it's the opposite with humans. Um, if they have increased cortisol levels or decreased serotonin levels, we start to see other things arise. So I almost wonder if they. Go ahead,
Yeah.
sorry.
Before you go on, the difference though is between the wild version and the domesticated version.
Right.
Right. So
Right.
individual cortisol and serotonin levels in a modern human can vary within a range that's pretty narrow.
Right.
But if you go back to our ancestors, our primate ancestors, you would see that the cortisol levels were like way out of that range, and the serotonin levels would be, way out of that range as well. And domestication actually brings them together and narrows that band.
Okay. So
Okay.
using a human being at a normally, I'm quoting that because whatever. But so using a human being as like a model of semi-stable serotonin and cortisol levels, it seems like once we brought this animal or the animal brought itself down to those levels as well, they became. I wonder what the other implications for that are outside of these smaller teeth, these, um, different facial features and ears and stuff like that. And like, I almost wonder if we were able to reproduce that because increased cortisol levels and serotonin levels or decreased, have other implications for humans as well. So have they ever
Sure.
tried to reproduce that?
Tried to reproduce what exactly?
Like so we have medicine and stuff like that for humans that are suffering from some sort of like psychological like illness, and that usually
Uh-huh.
has to do with serotonin,
Yeah.
cortisol, and other brain chemicals. So if we were able
Yep.
to see that this happens in animals, I mean, I know we're able to see that as well in humans, but is there something that we can do to reproduce those results so we have less of that stuff in humans? Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm making
Well,
sense.
yeah, it's a side effect of domestication, and we've domesticated ourselves to this point. There's, there's a question: do we want to domesticate ourselves even further and become more childlike? You remember the Time Machine movie where the guy goes way into the future and he meets the Eloi, and they're all very childlike. Um, you could assume that's what happened in that film, right? They evolved themselves to a point of domestication where they never stopped being children. So maybe that's a good idea, but maybe not.
Huh. All right.
Anybody else thoughts? Anybody here know any Neanderthals? No, I shouldn't have said that. Anybody who's not evolved? How about that?
There's certain humans though that still have the brow ridge and the jaws and things like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Like,
Well, like they probably lived or came from some isolated part of the world where the local evolution took them in that direction, right? But don't forget, everybody here, you got 4% Neanderthal genome. So as evolved as we are, we still have all of our genealogical baggage, all our evolutionary baggage. Scar, did you have your hand up? Were you looking to ask a question?
Of course I was.
Of course.
So I was in and out. My connection's really bad, so I don't know if I missed it. But I've always been quite interested in the change of pigmentation in animals as they become domesticated.
Uh-huh.
And looking
there's a neural crest disease in humans, by the way, where they have no pigmentation. They have white splotches. You've seen that, right?
That's literally where I'm going with this. So,
yeah,
because earlier on, I was taught that, this pigmentation, I don't know if it was just my teachers or if this was like misinformation being changed from the past, but, like a multicolored animal, that's going to be a co-dominant phenotype, when you have both dominant phenotypes present in the animal. But then looking at the neural crest and seeing how the pigmentation, as it starts at the base of the animal near the tail, and it like fails to spread that pigmentation throughout the animal over time, I was just wondering, like, is that going to happen to us as well, if we carry on the way we are?
Well, the pigmentation that you see in animals is in their fur. I don't think you're going to see that in human skin. Like I said, the disease that happens in the neural crest, the effect it has on humans is in the production of melanin in the skin. But it's either there or it's not there. You know what I mean? It's like if you got the disease, there just is no melanin. Where the result of domestication, you would expect to see hair that has like white patches in it.
Yeah.
And I'm turning gray, so I look very domesticated right now. But I don't think that happens in humans. I don't know why that would be the way it happens in animals. But we have a different thing too. I mean, animals have fur for the most part. And one of the characteristics of fur is that it reaches a length and stops growing. Where humans we have fur on our bodies because you have hair on your arms. It reaches a certain length, it stops growing. But you also have hair. And most animals don't have hair, they have fur. I have a dog that is a golden doodle, and it has hair. So I have to give it a haircut every so often, or its hair just keeps growing and growing and growing. But it's black and white, oddly enough. So I don't know.
But is there a way to?
It's never a simple thing, right?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, is there a way to know without looking into that segment, the locus that you put up? Is there a way to know if it's just a co-dominant phenotype presenting, or if this is, domestication syndrome?
Oh boy.
Or is domestication syndrome creating a co-dominant phenotype? Because that's not how I understand it. I understand it as, the neural crest is failing because that's a type of stem cell, right? And that's failing to spread throughout the animal as like a mild or like
it's still spreading just in less strength, right?
Yeah.
So it has less of an effect. And if it's a result of domestication, it's going to be throughout the domesticated part of the species, whereas phenotypes tend to show up in individuals in a species. So a phenotype would be the difference in the fur of a litter of kittens, where all sheep that are domesticated tend to be the same color in a given species of sheep. And all cows of a given species of cows, they all tend to have the same kinds of coloration patterns in their bodies.
Yeah.
I mean, I can show you a box that's painted like a cow, and it's painted like a cow. Right.
But so with the example of cows, so a roan cow, which would be a red and white,
Yeah.
is that a co-dominant phenotype, or are we domesticating them to make them do that?
That's
I-
a sign of domestication.
Because it's
red and
weird
white.
because if you go to, I'm not sure what the levels are in the US, but in the UK, if you go into a level 3 biology class, which is, I don't know if that's like high school or something, but
How many
they will
years have you been in school when you get there?
It's like, I think they're like 17, 18 years old at that point. Is that like high school?
Okay.
College? I don't know.
Yeah, that's high school.
But so at that point, biology, they will teach pigmentation of animals like a roan cow or a multicolored animal. They'll say that is a codominant phenotype presenting, and not that it's domestication syndrome. So I'm just wondering if that's one of those things where it's like, oh, you'll learn more about that if you choose that subject and you go on further. Like, it's too complex to teach you right now. But
well, I think it's more often a case of you're dealing with a teacher who learned what they learned 15 years ago, maybe. And 15 years ago, we didn't even know this is how domestication worked.
Yeah.
This is a relatively new science that's come up. And, you know, I mean, no offense to high school teachers. I have a teaching degree. I was going to be a math teacher when I was in college, and I changed my mind at the end there. But you know, that was my thing. And one of the things I noticed about people in teachers' colleges, they weren't all that bright as a rule, and the teachers were terrible. And we even used to say, those that can do, those that can't teach, and those that can't teach teachers. And that was me in a teachers' college saying that. So take it for what it's worth.
I mean, it's a shame that you didn't become a teacher, because you would have been great at it. My maths teacher was rubbish.
Thank you. But I would have been teaching math. You would have fallen asleep, and nobody would have cared. And I would have made no money. So I'm glad I didn't do that. Anybody else? Thoughts? Mr. Dika, you said something? Dika? Okay.
No, I'm just glad that you're teaching us. I live in Indonesia, where we absolutely restrained to learn about evolution theory, like because the majority of religion here are Muslims, so we don't really do that.
They
Anyway,
don't teach
I'm
evolution?
thankful for today.
Wow.
No, yeah, at all. Anyway, thank you.
Well, thank God for alt space, eh? Anybody else?
No pun intended.
No pun intended.
I wasn't allowed to learn about any of this growing up because of the schools that I went to, so I feel a little bit like a rebel right now.
If your mother finds out, you're in trouble, huh? You're going to be
I'm in
grounded?
trouble.
Sorry. Are you new to this group?
I just joined for the first time last week.
Okay. Did you click on the click here to join over there?
Yeah,
Have you done
I'm part
that?
of the Discord now,
Okay, great.
if that's what it's for. Yeah.
Yeah. Where's Gotham Girl? Is she still here? She's gone. And okay. Anybody else? Thoughts, ideas, questions, hopes? Yes?
Yeah, I noticed in the